All right, Richard, your go.
Hello, I'm Richard Johnson, and I'm the moderator for this particular session. And the session is entitled Let America Be America Again. And I'm joined by three wonderful, distinguished speakers on this panel. And the first is Dr. Wilfred Reilly. Dr. Wilfred Reilly is Assistant Professor of Political Science at Kentucky State University. Dr. Carol Swain, Professor of Political Science and Law at Vanderbilt, retired. Dr. Swain.
Thank you.
And Cathy Young, contributing editor for Reason. And we're going to have a lively discussion today, but before we jump right into our lively discussion, I want each one of our panelists just kind of give a brief intro, and then we'll go from there. And we'll start with Dr. Reilly.
All right, I'm Wilfred Reilly. As you mentioned, I'm an associate professor of political science at Kentucky State University. I'm also the author of the books Hate, Crime, Hoax, and Taboo, 10 Facts You Can't Talk About. And my understanding today is that we're discussing sort of the future for America, goals for the homeland, if you will, in context of a lot of the movements that are going on today, such as, for example, Black Lives Matter, that really have a transformative view of what society ought to be, that might be pursuing sort of a different set of national goals. So I didn't really prepare a long entry statement here, but I'm looking forward to doing that today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And Dr. Swain.
I'm Carol Swain. I'm a former professor of political science and law at Vanderbilt. I taught at Princeton and was tenured there before I became a professor at Vanderbilt. And I am the author of some books that are relevant to the discussion of race. My first book, Black Faces, Black Interests, the Representation of African Americans in Congress, won 3 national prizes, and it was cited by the US Supreme Court. The book that's most relevant for this moment is a book that was published by Cambridge Press in 2002, The New White Nationalism in America, Its Challenged Integration. And in that book, I warned that if we did not move away from identity politics and multiculturalism, that we were headed for the kinds of clashes we see taking place today. And I saw as the solution, the American national identity. So I'm looking forward to this discussion because this is a critically important issue and time for our nation.
Thank you. And Cathy, how are you? You look wonderful today.
Oh, well, thank you very much. This is my first Zoom conference, by the way, so this is a new experience for me, and I'm very, very excited to be here. My understanding was that we're talking partly about the issue of America's national future in the context of the 1619 project, which the conference was about. But I'm happy to obviously go off in other directions. But I am very interested in sort of identity issues, partly because I'm an immigrant. I came to this country at the tender age of 16 from what was then the Soviet Union. And I guess, my other kind of personal angle in this is that as someone who has followed the fate of the Soviet Union and then Russia very closely, I, have the, not firsthand, but sort of observational experience of what happens when, a country's conception of itself falls apart, which, in that case, obviously was a positive thing. I think we can all say that we're better off for, the Soviet Union not being there. But it's been really kind of fascinating and troubling in some ways to see some people basically say that America should engage in the same kind of really radical departure from its identity as, let's say, the Soviet Union did. The 1619 project was something that I took an interest in just from the standpoint of someone who's interested in history. And I did a piece that I think has been fairly widely cited for the Bulwark, which is an online magazine, kind of centrist in its direction, where I was looking at the history behind this, the quality of the research that went into this project. And, I was also looking at what it says and, what its conception is for the future of America. And, in terms of the title of the panel, Let America Be America Again, I think it's an interesting concept. I also don't know if it's in a way, if it's productive to say, let's move back to some, imagined golden age when, everything was wonderful. Obviously there is no golden age. And in some ways, obviously we have to move forward, not backward. We are clearly a changing nation in terms of demographic diversity. It is, very different in that sense from what it was, when I was born in 1963, or when I came here in 1980. So, but I think that what Carol said about a national identity as a kind of alternative to the splintering of ethnic and kind of multicultural identities is definitely a concept that we should, all be looking at today. And obviously, to do that, we also have to look at our history. And, my argument would be that American history, for all the imperfections, does provide the philosophical foundation for a national identity beyond race and ethnicity, even if, at the time that America was formed, most people didn't think of it in those terms. So, I guess let's just take that as the jumping off point and
Right.
get right into it.
Absolutely. Thank you. And now we can kind of segue into this. Wilfred, what do you think about America being America again? And also put that in the context of America moving forward. And I have another question for Dr. Swain after that.
Well, to some very real extent, I think that America is America now. One of the things that we have to remember when we look at these clashes between, say, black and white, working class and upper middle class, which really underlies a lot of this, is that, these brotherly quarrels are quite serious. We shouldn't ignore that. But the United States is literally the richest and most powerful country in the world. So there are very, very few people, even in other mighty nations, China, that wouldn't trade our problems for their countries. It's worth keeping that in mind. But I think the issue is whether America will continue to be America going forward. And I think, and Cathy probably might agree with this. Carol might have some comments on this as a political scientist as well. But balkanization is a very real threat in large, diverse states. Just look at the Balkans. Nations like Yugoslavia and the USSR, that were some of the most powerful countries, our historic rivals ever to exist, collapsed into what P.J. O'Rourke once jokingly called a series of tiny states with names like the Republic of You and Me, and I'm not sure about me, over recent recorded history. That's a real thing that can occur, and we do obviously want to avoid it here. What you're seeing in the USA right now is, to some extent, when you look at the 1619 Project specifically, since that's what we're discussing, a clash about the fundamental ideals of the country. So the traditional view of the USA among Black intellectuals and progressive white intellectuals has been, no one wants to ignore slavery, has been the USA has been flawed throughout its history, but has a set of ideals that is among the best sets of ideals in at least recent human national history. Almost all countries have experienced the sins, if you will, that humanity is prone to: wars of conquest, abuse of battle captives, enslavement of other persons, so on. However, we did so within the context of the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, what Lincoln once called the silver frame around the apple of gold. And our goal should be remedying the mistakes of the past while recognizing the good that's inherent in the US system. That's been the traditional view. I by and large agree with this. The 1619 Project, to a very real extent, is arguing that this is not true. Very, very explicitly. I've read all of the 1619 essays, and they say things like anti-Black racism is fundamental within America's DNA. That's a quote. virtually everything unique about the United States. And they go through this list of things from traffic patterns to our high sugar, high fat diet, comes specifically from the enslavement of Black people. Getting past this foundational sin will require massive changes to the country. I mean, there's a piece about healthcare that argues that we have a mostly private practice healthcare system because of slavery. By the way, a lot of these claims seem to be empirically untrue. I mean, I would refer people to Gordon Wood's analysis, some of the others. I'm not a historian myself, but a lot of this is very debatable. I mean, we don't see less traffic in the North, for example, or in recently constructed cities than the older cities of the South. Political scientists have empirically looked at that. There seems to be no basis for that whatsoever. But the idea is that the thing that makes the USA unique is in fact an evil. It's Black slavery. And to overcome that evil, and I presume also the conquest of Native Americans and so on down that, the indentured servitude of the Chinese and the Irish, although that's never really mentioned, it's a little more awkward. To overcome this, we would have to dramatically change who we are as a country. So that's the debate. 1619, at least the extremes of Black Lives Matter, Occupy, Antifa, a lot of these movements are specifically advocating for what traditionally would have been considered un-American goals. As an African-American man who plans to be a father in the near future, I mean, the one that I dislike the most is the elimination of the Black and I suppose the white nuclear family. That's in the platform for the movement of Black Lives. Platform of the movement for Black Lives, as I recall. Looked it up a couple weeks ago. I don't think it's been taken out. But this sort of stuff, we need to go to state kibbutzim instead of family. I mean, we're talking about change at this level. So that's the debate. We are American now, but 50 years from now, will we be? I'll close with a quick stat. I read recently that the majority, not a substantial minority, not a small minority, but the majority of individuals, I believe, under 30 in the USA right now that lean left politically, would like the USA to be a socialist rather than capitalist country, would like us to be majority minority. I don't really have a huge problem with that one, and would like us to be essentially disarmed in the context of the Second Amendment within the relatively near future. That's a different country. So if you have a debate about whether the USA should become a disarmed majority minority socialistic state going on at fairly high levels, then you have a fundamental clash about the nature of the country. I think what I consider the good side will win. When you look at actual statistics, 81% of African Americans want more police or the same amount in their neighborhood and know someone on the force and so on. I don't think the majority of taxpayers back some of these ideas. If you actually ask people anonymously off the record, do you think that biological males, for example, going a bit afield, should play competitive women's sports? Whichever side you're sympathetic to here, I don't think you'd get a mass majority answer yes. So I think there's a substantial amount of centrism in the country, support for sort of American traditional ideals. It's true for African Americans, whites, whatnot, but that clash is definitely going to come. And I think I just defined some of the parameters there.
Thank you. Dr. Swain, I have a question for you. Looking at the Constitution and Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution, most people have a misconception about the 3/5.
Yes.
3/5 compromise. And when you hear out in the general public that Black people were not looked at as human beings, they were looked at as less than human beings in the document of the Constitution, how do you respond to that?
Well, I mean, they are clearly repeating something they've heard that's false, and they're misinterpreting that clause. Anyone that has done research and gone back and looked at the discussion, the debate, and how the compromise came about would know that it was about representation in Congress, how many seats the North and South would get. And the South, they were perfectly willing to count their 600,000 slaves as whole persons because they'd get more seats in Congress. It was the anti-slavery North that wanted the restriction. And had they not won and gotten in that 3/5 clause, slavery might have continued even longer. So it was really an anti-slavery action on the part of the South, on the part of the North. And it's unfortunate that people use that to say that at the time the Constitution was ratified, Blacks were not considered as human beings, 3/5 a man. That's not true. It's false.
And Lincoln used that argument really to help push forward at the abolition of slavery, and this kicked off the Civil War. because
Yes.
basically Lincoln said there is no property in man designated in the Constitution.
That's an inconvenient truth that people that want to, perpetuate that false narrative, they just skip over the inconvenient truths. And I really wish that more people would look at American history and just, um, you know, you may not like everything, but at least acknowledge the good that was done. Don't make the nation worse off than it actually was or is. And the story of America that we are telling through the 1776 Unites consortium is the story of blacks and whites working together to overcome the stain of slavery. And you look at the Rosenwald schools, the black colleges and universities, those were institutions that were funded, by dollars from white Americans who did care. And there were always whites who agitated against slavery. So there was never a national consensus that slavery was the right thing to do, that slavery was the moral thing to do. And if you look at America's history, it is a Judeo-Christian country. All of our laws were influenced, by biblical roots. And I think that we lose a lot by skipping over those facts.
Absolutely, and I really appreciate you bringing up the Rosenthal adventure between Booker T. Washington and Rosenthal that basically helped to build over 5,000 schools in black communities, rural black communities across America. Cathy, what do you think about going forward? Can America be America and continue to grow as a nation going forward without losing its identity? And should it lose its identity?
Oh, well, I mean, I think, of course, it can continue going forward. I mean, I think, obviously, we're at a moment of, turmoil that certainly feels unique to us right now because we're in the middle of it. But, I've heard a number of people say, and I think there is something to that if you look at where we were in the 1960s and, even early 70s in terms of societal turmoil, in some ways, even if you look at political violence, there was a huge amount of political violence. There were bombs going off all the time. There were, these radical groups that were constantly killing cops. And I mean, we've had several incidents recently, but it's really not anywhere near the same scale. And certainly the anti-war movement had a lot of people in it who believed in, the very, very foundational change, transformation of the United States. There were a lot of people who were essentially, communists or quasi-communists. So, and I think we certainly got through that period in our history, and we're still here, and I think my hope is that we will look back at this as a kind of fascinating period when we did go through a lot of soul searching. We are, I think, going through that now. And, I think going back for a moment to the 1619 project and, the issue of coming to terms with the past, I think there is a kind of kernel of critique that makes sense, which is, a lot of people in America don't know very much about, the history of some of the things that happen in this country. And obviously, as Carol said, that includes things like the true nature of the 3/5 compromise. A lot of people, as, Carol was saying, do believe that was stemming from the belief that Black people are not complete human beings, and that it was, the slavery advocates who wanted that. And of course, it was the exact opposite. At the same time, I mean, I don't have a problem with saying that in many ways we've sort of under covered, so to speak, in the standard education that people get and the sort of exposure that we get to the, history of the revolution, etc. We've not paid enough attention in some ways to some of the issues associated with slavery. I mean, when I was doing research for my piece on the 1619 Project, I came across things that were kind of shocking to me. One example where I do think that, this is something that should be kind of a corrective to the standard view that we get of someone. I was reading about Patrick Henry, the guy who's, of course, most famous for the "Give me liberty or give me death" statement. And what I found out, and Patrick Henry was also very opposed to the ratification of the Constitution, which, when I took classes in American history in college and, later on, the standard version that we got was that he was this sort of ultra-libertarian guy who was, very concerned about the power of government and, which to a certain extent was true. But what I learned is that, interestingly enough, like one of the things that Patrick Henry apparently was most concerned about, the government doing was abolishing slavery. And he had this fascinating argument, by the way, which is just really kind of twisted. He basically argued that slavery is really, really horrible. And it is, in fact, so horrible that it's impossible to imagine that a federal government would not take action to, try to root it out in the states. And if that were to happen, that would be really, really bad for the, slaveholding states. And he really did believe that, owning slaves was, he was, of course, a Virginian. He believed that, owning slaves was really sort of essential to the way that Virginia was run. And I'm thinking, that should kind of maybe add a little wrinkle to, the way we see the, give me liberty or give me death guy. Maybe that really does, severely tarnish his record of being dedicated to liberty. So, I think that there are those things that we don't know enough about. I think there's a lot we could learn that I think does, as, Carol and Will were saying, point to cooperation between Black and white people. Even early on, there were soldiers who fought in the Revolutionary War, Black soldiers who had been, initially were forbidden to enlist. Then George Washington was persuaded to change his mind on that. And at one point, there were many, former slaves and even current slaves who joined the Revolutionary Army, who believed that they would be gaining their freedom. And in many ways, they were not treated very well after the war. They did not get the same benefits that in most cases that white veterans got. So, there's this history of, both brotherhood and betrayal. That would be a great title for a book, by the way, Brotherhood and Betrayal. And that would be kind of and I think that would be an angle to look at in terms of, Black and white relations. And I think, I don't think there's any problem with, becoming aware of these, less savory sides of our history. I think we can only be stronger if we look at that. And, at the same time, we can see, Thomas Jefferson had a really complicated and fascinating history of sort of both being anti-slavery on a kind of fundamental philosophical level, and especially in the later part of his life, really sort of settling into this very rigid attitude that, we've made this compromise with slavery and we really shouldn't mess with that, at least for now, because that will, destabilize the nation. And there's some fascinating correspondence where people were asking him, in the early 19th century, to speak up in favor of abolitionism when by that time he was already, the former president. And he really just would not do that and would basically say, well, I'm leaving that to the next generation. And, this is a good set. But I think it does also point to the way forward, which is that, we can build on understanding all of that, and we can build on, the part that was always very future oriented and very reform oriented. So.
Absolutely. I'm gonna have to jump right in. Carol, I see you want to respond to that.
Well, Cathy had so much to say. And I wanted to respond when she talked about the 1960s, that turmoil of the 1960s. We survived that, and what's taking place today is not quite as bad. I see what's taking place today, taking place in the context of a new America where the Marxists and critical race theorists have gained so much control and power that they are driving a narrative that can be very destructive to the US. And in the 1960s, America had a stronger religious, spiritual connection as far as its Judeo-Christian foundations. I would argue that more people knew what the country was about. I was born in 1954. That was the year the Brown v. Board of Education case desegregating schools. I saw those civil rights acts open up opportunities for people like me. And I think that we had a better idea of who and what we were as a nation. But because so many people who were trained as Marxists have been able to take leadership of major institutions, we have a population now that's very ignorant about the Constitution and about the values and ideals that made America an exceptional nation. And I think that the fact that so many young people think socialism is okay is a danger, as well as the fact that a lot of us older people are not standing up at this moment and pointing out that the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment protects all Americans. The 1964 Civil Rights Act bans discrimination on account of race and ethnicity and national origins. And at this moment, I think that we are moving in a direction where we're saying it's okay because of the legacy of slavery to discriminate against whites or discriminate against people because of their skin color. And we don't want a colorblind society and equality under the law. Those of us who once thought that those were worthy ideals, we have been silenced. We're not speaking up enough. And that's what I think is wrong with America. And I agree with you, Cathy, about, the less savory beliefs of some of our founding fathers, the fact that they were forebears, were not perfect people. That's fine for people to know that they were imperfect like the rest of us, but that doesn't change America, and it doesn't change the good these people did. Doesn't mean their monuments ought to be torn down.
Oh, no, definitely.
Yeah, I know that you weren't arguing that, but I think that we can learn from their mistakes. And if we learn from their mistakes, we can be better people and a better nation.
Will, is America growing up in some of these just growing pains of America? Because we've grown, since 1787, and we've come through civil wars. Hundreds of thousands of people died in the Civil War as a part of that growing pain. Then we moved a little bit further and a little bit closer to the true ideals of freedom that's mentioned and talked about in the Constitution. And we continue. We came through 1964, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and there was turmoil and growing pains. And here we are 56 years later, going through another growing pain. Are we just growing up?
I don't think so. I think this lawlessness is a part of a regression.
Yeah, well, I mean, I thought, so the short answer is this is a potential growing pain, but I don't think we should grow in the direction, as Dr. Swain said during the last comment, that's sort of being suggested here. So the issue with the civil rights movement, if you look at the real historical civil rights movement, 1954, 1964, 67, was that civil rights for African Americans, women, and others didn't really exist. My partner, Jane, pointed out during a conversation a couple of days ago that she would have needed my approval to get a home loan until, I believe, 1981. So when you look at first wave feminism, or when you look certainly at that Black civil rights movement, the issue was that the fundamental powers and privileges there for those groups didn't exist. So our society took what I think was an important, necessary step toward moral adulthood by fighting across racial and gender lines, obviously, because the disenfranchised aren't often capable, as brave as they are, of totally freeing themselves to obtain those rights for everyone. What's being sought right now is a different sort of social change but one that would fundamentally transform the USA into a different sort of state. I mean, the argument right now that's being made is very, very often, if you look at the actual writing of the Green New Deal, for example, an argument for state socialism, for governmental control of major resource sets, if not actual means of production, for increases in tax rates that in practice would put our taxing structure on par with, say, Sweden's or Norway's and so on down the line. So I think the people that are proposing this, short answer, think that it's a step we need to take forward to be a mature nation, but I personally hope we don't take it. I think it's an extremely bad idea. The difference between the civil rights movement of the past and the civil rights arguments today is that civil rights now exist. So one of the things that's going on here actually has been the redefinition of some of these terms. So racism, obviously, and I'd be interested in what the other panelists have to say about this, but has historically meant something very simple. It's a dislike of other human beings simply or primarily because of their membership in a particular race. And this has declined dramatically as a construct over the past 40, 50, 60 years. I don't think anyone would deny that. In political science, there's a whole series of anonymized survey questions we ask. Would you vote for someone of a different race? Would you marry them? Work for them, so on down the line. And the percentage of people in totally anonymized situations that identify as traditional bigots, in terms of the voting question, for example, last year was 7%. So what we're now seeing is a redefinition of racism to mean something much more broad and diffuse. I mean, if you actually read some of this critical theory, like Ibram Kendi's work, for example, what he's saying is that any system that produces sort of disparate outcomes, differences in how people perform, is racist. He says this really explicitly. The argument is that the only two explanations for the difference, and I think he cited SAT scores and how to be an anti-racist, so you guys might correct, but the only two explanations for this difference in SAT performance would be, one, the underperforming group is somehow inferior. He means essentially genetically, deeply, permanently inferior. Or two, the metric being used, even if it's facially neutral, is racist. I would suggest a third option: rates of studying for the test vary dramatically across individuals and groups. But we're now seeing an attempt to redefine racism as any system that doesn't produce total equity among groups. And the claim is that the new civil rights movement is fighting all systems that don't produce total equity among groups. The problem with that is that would literally be all systems. Don't want to be glib here, but I mean, the NBA right now has, I believe, 2 full-time Asian American players, which I think of as Jeremy Lin and somebody else. So if we actually wanted to take these ideas seriously, it would require systemic, total reshaping of the United States. There are people that want that. I don't think that is a growing pain we need to endure, I guess would be a simple answer. I don't think we'd get anything good out of that one. As a very quick comment, by the way, about the discussion between Carol and Cathy, which I think was a good one that just occurred, I tend to agree, points on both sides, but I tend to agree that obviously the clashes today aren't worse in some empirical sense than those of 1968. If you look at levels of white on black violence, I don't think there's a group today that's on par with the Ku Klux Klan. If you look at levels of black on white violence, I don't think there's a group today that's on par with the original Panthers, although the overall crime rates are a bit higher today. I think that the issue, though, and Carol touched on this, is that the hard left has been very successful at getting control of systems. This is something that I don't think was true if you're looking at the USA during the Eisenhower era, or even the Nixon era. So 1619's ideas are being taught as curriculum in a very large chunk, probably more than 1/10 of American schools. And this goes back to, in political science, some of the communist theorists like Antonin Gramsci, who said, look, as Reds, the language used at the time, we're not very likely to get control of competitive business or of the military, agriculture, large religion. What we need to do is control discourse. So we can take what might normally be thought of as fringe ideas and put those out into the public space constantly. And I frankly think that's happened. The idea that the USA began 160 years before our actual date of founding, that the thing that defines us is slavery, and that we should reshape everything from the healthcare system to our traffic circles to deal with this historical sin would have been considered a very, very fringe idea until quite recently. We hear about this idea, however, today from the New York Times or from prominent big city school boards. So I think that this is absolutely an accurate point on Carol's end. I mean, whether or not there are more guys on the streets with signs, I'd say there are fewer of them. We've allowed this to some extent. I mean, we've allowed higher educational institutions to become places where people conceal the fact that they're conservatives or centrists, which is remarkable when you think about it. I mean, those groups combined are 65% of the country or more. The Yale University, I tend to ramble on with the stats, the last one, but Yale University, a couple of their top quants actually looked at the percentage of conservative professors they thought existed on campus, and they got 0%. You can Google Yale University 0% faculty conservative and find out how they ran their model and so on. I have a couple critiques, but it was a pretty good one. But I mean, I do think that that amount of control of discourse, by which I mean academia, the top high schools, the NGO sector, the print media, the broadcast media, by the extreme left, does change the debate a little bit. I think that the issue here, though, is that the extreme left, if you look at the number of actual votes for, say, Bernie Sanders in swing states, any metric you want to use, the number of actual advocates this group has is extremely small. And that limits the reach of what they can do without other people backing them. And that's why there's such an intense focus on guilting people, in my opinion. But at any rate, yeah, there's an idea that we should move forward. We should make these social changes. I don't think that that's a natural part of growing up, however. That would be a part of becoming an alcoholic, might be an analogy. That would be a change made by an adult society that I disapprove of.
And it's interesting, it's interesting, Will, you bring out an interesting point. Is this socialism versus, capitalism and democracy, flying the flag of racism?
Well, so you're asking, yeah, I mean, that's an excellent phrasing of that question. So you're asking to some extent, is this a Marxist movement using people of color?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it is. I mean, this is one of the things that I find, first of all, I mean, I won't deny that I think there's sometimes an attempt to hide the fact that there is a racist hard right. I mean, if you actually, I recently wrote it's probably going to go up as a monograph on my website. I don't know if I'm going to publish as a book, but I wrote a text called Alt Wrongs, which is a criticism of a lot of this alt-right white nationalism we've seen in recent years. Carol's obviously written, one of the defining books in this field. This is a real issue. And if you actually talk to some of these people, they never say, yes, I'm a racist, right? I mean, they always say, I'm an America First nationalist or some such gibberish, and you have to go through 15 minutes of Twitter debate. Why is your profile picture, a frog waving an American flag, my brother? Countryman at any rate. But so leaving that aside, however, I think that it's probably accurate to say that in general, normal conservatives are not more racist using a whole number of metrics than normal leftists. In fact, the reverse is sometimes the case. So there was a study recently that found that liberals, but not conservatives, dumb down everything they say when they talk to Black people. That the tone of voice, the length of words literally changes by about 30% when people who identified as hard left are talking to an African American. It's one of the funniest pieces of research I've ever read. But I think in that context, comparing the ordinary center-right guy who was a soldier or played some football with the people that are doing this like painful, yeah, bro, got some hot sauce in my purse routine, I don't think the second group likes Black people more. I think the idea on the part of a lot of hard leftists is that Black people, and now, by the way, we're sort of being replaced by the legal and illegal, largely Latino immigrant population in this role, but are a lumpen proletariat. I.e., if we can be convinced we have these long-standing beefs with the white countrymen we've sometimes clashed with, we can be used as a tool for pushing through these far-left policies. If you actually go in, and I don't want to focus on sort of fringe issues like the trans debate, but they are a good metric for how far left or right people actually are. I mean, in my discipline, if you actually ask some of these questions, like, are you a regular weekly or daily churchgoer? Or how do you feel? Do you feel that biological males can simply transition to life as women? Or for that matter, gay marriage. I'm strongly pro-gay marriage. That's not the mainstream position in the Black community. You ask normal Black people these sort of things, they're going to give a fairly conservative position. And there are other issues like illegal immigration that I'm pretty right on this, that openly hurt the Black community. If you're talking about an urban working class community, there's no way to deny that. The reason that we have been brought along and are voting in support of some of these issues very much is this idea of, well, do you want to support the racists? I mean, and this isn't unique to Donald Trump at all. I mean, when Mitt Romney, who is a milquetoast center-right Republican, he wrote part of Bain's diversity statement running for president, talking about he had binders full of women, and I believe minorities as well. A bit awkward, but positive on the diversity front. Joe Biden said he was going to bring back slavery. He's going to put y'all back in chains, putting on this sort of fake black scent. So yeah, I don't, yes, is the short answer. Obviously, the pitch to the black community is vote for this whole package of things like the Green New Deal, or the racists will be in power and you'll be hanging from trees. And I simply don't think that's realistic if you're talking about a Mitt Romney presidential administration. That's just nonsense.
Carol, how do we get beyond that? Because Will's making a definitely true point about how African Americans have been somewhat hoodwinked here. How do we get beyond that? What's the pathway through? What's the formula?
I believe that if we keep putting out truth and facts, that sooner or later they will sink in. And I think you see change within the Black community already. And as far as progressives, white liberal progressives, to me, they hate Blacks. And I know that hate is a strong way to describe what I believe is the relationship between Blacks and progressives. But if they didn't hate Blacks, why would they be pushing abortion the way they do in Black communities? And we are aware of the stats that show that in some cities, more Black babies are aborted than are born alive. Progressives push defunding the police, even while they know that Blacks are more likely to be victims of crime or perpetrators, that if you live in the inner city, your life is in danger. So there's a reason why 81% of Black Americans want more police, but progressives say, no, defund the police. Progressives are willing in their cities to use coronavirus as a reason to shut down public schools, knowing that the poorest of the poor, the parents are not going to be able to do the online education. And so those minority kids that are poor, and poor whites as well, will not get an adequate education. And then my last bit of evidence that progressives hate minorities is with coronavirus. They have put out and said that the stats show that people of color are more likely to contract and die of coronavirus, and that we needed to wear masks and social distance. These same people encourage minorities to protest and to get out on the streets, and they relax the regulations against crowds when it came to Black people. And so everything I see, the messaging of the political left, it's not life-giving, it's very much destructive. And in my experience, 28 years in academia, the worst racists have been the progressives. They support affirmative action because they think Blacks are so stupid that they would not be able to accomplish anything unless it was handed to them. And so they are on board with segregation. They believe they want Blacks segregated. So they are on board with taking and allowing in our colleges and universities a resegregation totally contrary to everything that the Civil Rights Act was about. They are on board with lowering the academic standards for Black people because they don't believe Black people are capable of competing. So I just think that progressives are our enemies. They're an enemy of Black people and our nation as a whole, and equal opportunity.
Can I jump in here?
Go right ahead, Cal.
Sure.
Just about to call on you.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of respond briefly to what Carol said. And I just want to make sure, I definitely do not consider myself a progressive in the terms that is currently defined. I would caution against kind of going the same route as some of the kind of race radicals do on the other side, in terms of saying, like, if you advocate for things that I believe negatively affect Black people, even if they're sort of seemingly racially neutral, you hate Black people. I mean, I think it's entirely possible for people to honestly disagree and have different perspectives on some of these things. So I really wouldn't kind of jump to the conclusion that, I mean, obviously some of the people who argue for, defunding the police, I mean, I think they're profoundly deluded, and I think they have a very kind of utopian idea of what's going to happen, in the absence of a strong police force. But I don't think that means that they actually, actively on some level want more killing of Black people in the absence of police. So, I mean, I think that we should kind of, try to not necessarily ascribe, nefarious motives to people. I also wanted to real quick kind of possibly correct something, or at least amend something that Will said about Joe Biden's he's going to put you all back in chains, a comment about Romney, because I actually recently looked up that controversy, and he was talking a bit to a mixed audience that did have a lot of African Americans, but was I think like 50-50 white Black, and he was ostensibly talking about loosening bank regulations. And I think the argument there was that, Mitt Romney is going to sort of let all these, big banks lord over you. And there was a controversy about whether that was sort of a racial dog whistle, so to speak, to use a very popular word right now. And, Joe and Biden did in fact argue that he was not trying to kind of use it as a racial code. Now, whether or not that was true, I leave that to you. But I mean, I do want to say that he did not actually say, Mitt Romney is going to, restore slavery or anything like that.
All right.
So,
Cathy.
Wait. Cathy, we got to have some rules. Everybody continue their statements, and then I, as the moderator, can allow others to come in. So, Cathy, complete your statement.
Okay, right. Thank you. Yeah, and I mean, I'll be happy to have some back and forth on that. But I do want to say, I think that in terms of where we go from here, I mean, I absolutely agree that there is, first of all, that there has been a weakening of education in terms of, historical knowledge of, of the revolution, of some of the things that happened, around the Civil War, the Civil Rights Movement. So I think we definitely need to have a better educational system. I would once again kind of caution against the kind of idealization of what happened in the past in terms of the knowledge of history until recently. There was my understanding is, at least in a lot of the southern states, there was a lot of resistance to acknowledgement that the Civil War was about slavery. I mean, and I've run into those people online who will still say, oh, well, actually, it really was about states' rights. And I always say, well, if you look at the declarations of secession that were passed by the southern states, the right that they were most insistent about, the states' right that they were really hammering on there, explicitly, was the right to own slaves. So, I mean, it's kind of a semantic thing where, yeah, they were talking about their rights being trampled, but that was mainly the right that they were talking about. And I think, there were, I know that until the 1980s, there were questions occasionally about schools, again, mostly in the South, using literature that really kind of whitewashed, so to speak, the experience of slavery, and kind of tried to say, oh, well, actually, it was kind of mostly benign, and, most of the slaves were treated well, so it really wasn't that bad. So I think there were real distortions of history kind of in the other direction that were happening.
Let's keep it, we got about 30 seconds.
So I think that's something that we should also not forget. And I think we should kind of move forward and build on that. And, I mean, I think the 1619 Project, some of the essays I thought had a lot of interesting information. I learned a lot of interesting things, researching based on the 1619 Project that I didn't know about. Certainly there were serious misconceptions Sorry about that. I'm just gonna.
But while you're grabbing that, why don't we bring Carol in? Cathy, why don't we bring Carol in and so she can respond?
I can say that Cathy can easily fill up an hour lecture. She's not going to have any problem. I purposely used the expression hate, knowing that it's very strong. When I look at what progressives have done to Blacks, I was born and raised in Virginia. And as a young adult, a lot of my cousins were among those sterilized when they got pregnant as teens. They went into the hospital, and while they were giving birth, the doctors presented them with paperwork. And so these young women were sterilized. And then later, when they got married, they wanted to have children, they were sterilized. And Virginia was one of the states where the sterilization took place. It's always been governed by progressives. Everything that I've seen that's come from progressivism has been strongly anti-Black. And so I'm using the expression hate because when you actually look at what's taking place, I see the same kind of hate that came from the KKK. It has changed form. It's the same thing. It's changed form. And I grew up in the segregated South. I started off at segregated schools, and I have watched all of this. And I think that that's where I'm coming from with my observations about what I see in the world. And Cathy, coming, from a different culture and background, I think that's why we differ on the things that we differ. I mean, now I'm going to use something from the critical race theorists. I have had lived experience.
Right.
All right. Hey, Will, we got a couple of questions from the audience. And one is, what are the civil rights for an extended republic?
All right, that's a good question. Now, just very quickly about the most recent sort of back and forth exchange. I think it's important not to be too painfully reasonable in kind of that center-right space. I mean, so Cathy's absolutely right. Joe Biden denied he was race baiting. I mean, that is valid. You probably have noted it. But what he did was look at, I believe the front of the audience was mostly African-American, and say something along the lines of, put you back in chains, if you know what I mean. He's going to put you back in chains. People stood up, started clapping. I don't think Joe Biden was just referring specifically to international banking regulations in the mind of the people that are responding. But if you want to use an alternate quote there, and then good points on all sides, we'll move on from that exchange. Joe Biden specifically said, if you don't vote for me and the Democrats, you ain't Black. When he was
right, no, that's I agree with you. That was bad. I totally agree. Yeah.
Then just last one, he also said, I really believe poor kids can be just as smart as white kids. I mean, Joe Biden would be viewed as Joe Biden's actual behavior on race. And I think both of these guys, I don't think politicians should really be on Twitter, by the way, a side point. But I mean, both of these guys have let the mouth fire off quite a bit. But Joe Biden's comments on race, what was the exact quote? They may have been segregationists, but they got stuff done, something like that. That is a paraphrase. Poor kids are just as smart as white kids. The thing about, corn pop and the chain fight, Joe Biden's actual conversations about race in terms of awkwardness are easily on par with Trump's, in my opinion, with maybe one or two exceptions. The heuristic for Joe Biden, however, is, well, he is a centrist Democrat, so he is good on race. So he called one of the country's top Black TV journalists a junkie. Or if we're being very specific, he asked him if he was a junkie. He asked if he had taken a cognitive test. He said, "Have you?" Let's get to the question.
Let's respond to the audience a little bit and make sure that we answer those questions. I appreciate your response.
But I do think, as a political scientist, these heuristics are important. We see Republicans greedy, Democrats nice. Anyway, but so the question: what civil rights do you need for an extended republic? I think that we have most of them in place, actually. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964 essentially removed the right to private bigotry to some extent. I mean, the general assumption in the USA was always that you could be a racist jackass in your personal life and in any business practice that was an extension of that. Excuse me. So if you had a golf club, for example, If you had a roadside barbecue restaurant, black or white, so on down the line, you were free to exclude African Americans, gay people, Caucasians, whatever the case might be. The Civil Rights Act very specifically says that in terms of accommodations, hiring, and workplace activities, so on down the line, you almost can't discriminate, at least if you're talking about race, color, ethnicity, nationality, sex, so on down the line. There are now a series of supplementary laws that have moved sexual orientation essentially to this category. So beyond that, I don't really see that you need, essentially the Bill of Rights plus the Civil Rights Act is an excellent foundation. I don't think you necessarily need substantially more civil rights as a baseline than those. I think that the real debate here is about equality versus equity, by the way. So right now, I think everyone in the USA is fairly equal in terms of their ability theoretically to compete. If you took a black immigrant from Nigeria and a white immigrant from Bosnia and put them both in the same entry-level post-college $30,000 a year job, they would have probably very, very similar outcomes in life. I don't actually think this is particularly disputed. In fact, people, the Snyderman and Carmines, I believe, looked at this. There are two issues with this. One is that because of past racism, and Cathy's right, I mean, we can't ignore some of the things that have gone on in American history. There are groups, like even going beyond African Americans or Southern poor whites, I mean, Native Americans on reservations come to mind. There are groups that have not traditionally had the same access to resources and are starting from a much lower base. That's problem one when it comes to encountering total equality. You can go to college as a Native American Indian. In fact, you have an enormous advantage applying to most colleges, if we're being blunt. But are you going to have the same percentage chance of doing so coming from a reservation background? That's issue one. And issue two is that even in totally fair competitions, people perform differently. People get different SAT scores because some people are smarter than other people. That's the primary mechanism. I mean, I don't think there are many communities where you can't walk down to the library and open up a book. So the civil rights that we have guarantee already rough equality among equal people in competitive terms. The question is, what do we do about the harms of the past? I mean, if you look at the Indian Wars 150 years ago, this has nothing to do with most modern white or black Americans, but how do we equalize that to be fair? That's question one. And question two is, what do we do about the fact that in a totally fair system, different groups perform differently? If you look at different groups of middle-class immigrants that come here from other countries that have no exposure to our past history, they range from the highest earning groups in the country, Indian Americans, to the lowest earning groups in the country, like, for example, Somali Americans. And obviously many Somali Americans have some claim to refugee status, not a fully equal competition. But what do you do when in an equal race facilitated by civil rights, people perform differently? And that, I think, is what leads to the equity argument. And I'd be interested in sitting down, and I'll issue this almost as a challenge, but with a well-intentioned critical race theorist and talking about this. I mean, what is the solution? I mean, would college admissions be solely by lottery? I mean, I've debated people like Rod Graham that are great guys and talked about some of this, but I've never really heard an answer to it. But at any rate, I think that the civil rights you need in an extended republic like ours, democratic baseline, but obviously elements of Republican structure, such as the Senate, the Electoral College, are to some extent the civil rights we have. We're not an unsuccessful country. The problem, to say the least, the problem is that those civil rights have not produced utopia. What do you do about the fact that meritocracy tends to produce very different outcomes for people based on performative skill? That's a question humans have yet to answer.
Dr. Swain, there's another question for you here, and it is, how can you get your voice heard in left-leaning America, and could you get an op-ed published in the New York Times?
When I was a Democrat, I could get an article published in the New York Times. I don't know about that today. I don't think we can make them give us a platform, but if we're loud enough and we reach enough people through other means, I think that we have to bypass some of the established channels. And if we are having the kind of impact that we would want to have, I think they will eventually come to us. I don't think they can always exclude. For myself, if I can influence people, because I know through my social media that there are people from left-leaning organizations that follow me, I think that that's the best that we can hope for at this time.
through social media?
Well, I'm just saying that we can't force the liberal media to publish our opinion pieces, but if they follow us through social media, they are hearing what we have to say. And I think we can have an impact. Like yesterday, I gave an interview to a Washington Post reporter. I don't know if the article has been published or if he actually cited me. I think he did because he read quotes from a talk I gave at the Council on National Policy. And and so I always take the phone calls of liberal reporters. I never turn down invitations. I would go on CNN or MSNBC or any of those networks if I were invited.
Cathy, thank you so much. And Cathy, here's a question the audience is posing to you: is explain the emphasis of multiculturalism versus assimilation and the problems of defining America. How it's
That's a
defining
really
America.
great question. I think multiculturalism, and it's kind of interesting, by the way, I'm just as an aside, it's interesting that you don't really actually hear the word multiculturalism anymore that much. I think it was very much kind of in vogue in the 1980s, 1990s. And today there's almost a kind of degree of among on the left, there's an advocacy of something different, of basically this kind of cultural, because multiculturalism really kind of presumes maybe that you kind of focus on or take in the heritage of different cultures, but also you all kind of come together, in that context, and, different people bring their own cultures to that mix. So it's not exactly like assimilation into the sort of Anglo, European based American culture, but there is still a kind of commonality. And today on the left, there is really an advocacy of a far greater degree of cultural balkanization, where, we hear arguments that cultural appropriation is wrong, that if you, for instance, for Halloween, if you dress up in the costume of somebody with a different heritage, if you're a white person who dresses up as, let's say, Mulan, you should not be allowed to do that because, you're sort of appropriating the heritage of another culture. Or if you're a white novelist who writes a book with Black characters, you're appropriating the voice of these Black characters. There was a fascinating incident a couple of years ago in which The Nation, which is a sort of leading progressive magazine, published a poem by a white writer that was in the voice of a homeless Black woman and was written in African American vernacular. And people just, were outraged because, this is this white guy who is stealing the voice of a Black woman. And, this is crazy. So I think we've kind of gone even beyond multiculturalism. So I think the need for, an argument for a common culture, I think, is very important right now. And that doesn't mean that, different ethnic groups don't have their own subcultures. I think that's always been true. So I think that's sort of the melting pot metaphor from the, early 20th century, where we all kind of bring, different things to that kind of communal culture. And I think that's really what we should look to, which doesn't necessarily mean, a melting pot in the sense that we all completely lose any sense of ethnic identity. That's never really been true in America, I think. Different groups, I think, have had different levels of sort of ethnic self-identification. Like there's never, for instance, been a really strong, French American identity in France. On the other hand, if you look at Italian Americans, that's a group that's, historically always has had a pretty strong ethnic identity. Irish American, lots of different groups, have been very American, while having a strong sense of ethnic identity. identity. So I don't think there's anything wrong with that per se. I think the thing that we really do need to recover is that, first of all, there is, beyond all of that, there is a common American identity, and and also that no one really owns any culture. I mean, you can be, you can be a proud Italian American, but that doesn't mean that you're gonna freak out if somebody who's not Italian makes a movie.
To that point, to that point, let's bring Carol in, because I know she wants to chime in on that discussion with you.
Well, I want to chime in because someone has a question about bias response teams at over 200 colleges for reporting alleged biases. I think it's very important for conservatives to use those processes that institutions have set up when it comes to racially, quote, insensitive comments in the classroom. If you, as a white male or a white female, if you're singled out and you're told that you're the root of all evil and your ancestors are responsible for the sins and that you are a racist and all of the things, because you believe in traditional family, you're a homophobe, or all of these names, I think it's very important that when we see bias against us as Christians or conservatives or white people, I'm not white, but I'm sympathizing with you folks, that we report them if they are violating their own rules, that we need to hold our enemy accountable to his own rule book. That came from Saul Alinsky. We need to be steeped in Saul Alinsky's rules for radicals and use our knowledge to our advantage. And so they've set up these systems for reporting bias. Yes, report bias, record it, keep records, and just make them live up to their own edicts.
Well, Cathy mentioned something. She said common culture. Does the flag, supply itself as a symbol for a common culture, Americanism?
I think that a basic affection for the flag is a sign that the teaching of common culture has worked. Obviously, to some extent, symbols are just that. They're symbols. I mean, at root, a flag is our symbol on a piece of cloth. If my house were on fire, I would rescue my pets, valuables, make sure my partner was okay. I don't think, as patriotic as I am, I'd go back in and grab the flag. But I mean, at the same time, if I saw a flag on the ground walking through the downtown of a city that happened to be ours or even that of an allied nation, I'd probably pick it up, whereas I wouldn't for most other banners. So that sort of basic affection, not hating your country, is a good sign that cultural training, conditioning, if you want to be blunt, has worked. What does a shared culture mean? I think Cathy did a good job defining that. In political science, we do look at that in detail. And there are a couple of elements. I mean, traditionally, America has been the first democracy. So there's a great deal, sometimes to almost an excessive degree, but probably productive, of veneration for our founding fathers' core principles, ideas. So there's the Constitution, there's the Declaration of Independence. So part of our culture is the first modern democracy, that ideal. Obviously, of course, there were democracies in ancient Greece, smaller ones locally around the world. Part of our cultural idea is that we're the capitalist democracy. So I mean, there's that whole Horatio Alger tradition, the idea that here government doesn't provide everything, people go compete, you can be successful, go west, young man. I mean, that's very much a part of what's taught in the schools. I mean, there are economics and business courses in some of our high schools. I took some of them in East Aurora Senior. We're the destination democracy. I mean, for all our racial quarreling, I don't think anyone would deny that immigrants have made up the majority, almost the entirety of the population of this country. It's widely accepted that you might take some harassment when you first get here, but people can come from anywhere in the world, become Americans, Russians, Italians, so on. That's very much part of our culture. If you come here from Ireland and you stay here for 15 years, you are an American, you're an Irish American. Thinking of some of my travels on business, if you go to Japan for 15 years and you stay there and you're popular enough with your community, you're not Japanese. You will never be Japanese. You will be a respected foreign guest of Japan that might be asked to leave under certain circumstances. So those are three elements of our culture: the founding tradition, the capitalist ethos, the welcoming for all the caveats of immigrants. And then there's a popular shared culture. I mean, I don't think I could name an American male who didn't know what, or female for that matter, who didn't know what the Super Bowl was. We're now doing more narrowcasting than broadcasting, but if I go into work at a historically Black college for that matter, I mean, the number of people that have watched Game of Thrones when that was the concluding season, that were aware of the major moments in our culture at that time was 60, 70%. So that's what a shared culture means. I mean, an awareness of history, an awareness of certain traditions, a respect for styles. I mean, I'm wearing a blazer from the store chain Brooks Brothers, not a kimono. I mean, no disrespect to that alternative style, but I mean, that's what American culture means. And the training in all of that is represented by the flag to some extent. So I think if you see someone urinating on their national flag or burning it or doing some of the things you see at these rallies, that is a sign. I mean, I view those actions as immoral, but whatever your position on the ethics of that, that's a sign that the cultural training given to that person has failed pretty notably. And I think cultural training in a relatively good society such as ours is a good idea. You can't have, this gets back to multiculturalism versus diversity. You can have a bunch of people that look different. And in fact, I greatly enjoy that. I'm a fan of diversity in social environments, but you can't have a group of people that totally think differently about everything to the point of clashing about foundational ideas and succeed for long as a society.
And I know that our time is winding down, so I have a question for each one of you, and take your time as you go and respond to this. Are we in trouble? You know, is America in trouble of not being America anymore? And I'll start with you, Karen.
I would say absolutely yes, that America is teetering on the edge of a precipice. And I've said it many times. And back in 2002, I published with Cambridge Press, The New White Nationalism in America, Its Challenge to Integration. And I talked about how the left's arguments in favor of identity politics and multiculturalism were very destructive in the long run, because it provided a justification for every group, including white Americans, to identify by race and to advance white interests and white identity. And that the only way we would save a nation as diverse as America was, one, to respect everyone's rights. And that goes back to the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, the 1964 Civil Rights Act and its protections. But we have to move away from identity politics, where everyone is trying to advance the perceived interests of their group. We have to look to that American national identity where we advance the interests of all. We also have to open up dialogue, go back to the Constitution, and give teeth to the First Amendment. And I was told when the book was published that the people that were white nationalists, that they didn't deserve to be heard. I believe that what you don't know can hurt you. And to the extent that there are some very legitimate issues that relate to Black crime, racial preferences, liberal immigration policies, and we can go down the list of globalization. All of these things affect all Americans. And if we don't have politicians that are willing to address those issues, you will have simmering grievances among the people. And they will listen to those that they feel are representing them. And as long as we have, Black race leaders out there and Black Lives Matter, and in my opinion, Black Lives Matter organization is very much akin to the KKK. If the Southern Poverty Law Center actually tracked hate groups and hate organizations, they would have them included. And if you look at the hate crimes, the Black on white hate crimes, but we don't call them hate crimes, I think they would be astronomical. And when I hear the director of the FBI say that white supremacists are the greatest domestic threat, I don't see them committing at this point in time the heinous crimes that I read about every day that are taking place against whites, where people are targeting white people and white police because they are white. I think to the extent that we turn a blind eye to these things, we set ourselves up for that opening scene of a book by William Pierce called the Turner Diaries that the FBI said was the Bible of the racist right that Timothy McVeigh had in his car when he was arrested. It is about a race war. And the opening scene had to do with this progressivism that had taken over the country, and there was so much violence. I feel like we're living through the opening chapter of the Turner Diaries, and people better wake up. If we don't get this law and order situation under control, our nation is doomed. And if we don't stop allowing the critical race theorists and the Marxists to use diversity, I always want to say exclusion, diversity, equity, inclusion training, which is Marxist critical theory indoctrination to divide us, we also destroying our nation. We don't need that kind of training. What we need in America is training that will bring us together, unity training, the e pluribus unum, out of many, one. We need to get back to our American motto. And that's all I have to say about that.
All right, Cathy, and then we'll bring Wilfred in.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, are we in trouble? I mean, I think it's interesting because I agree with some of Carol's prescriptions. I think it's absolutely imperative to move beyond identity politics and move toward unity. I don't think the situation is quite as dire as Carol suggests. I think, the violence that we're seeing, I think is certainly very concerning. I think it's not quite as, rampant as one might think. Even if you look at places like Portland, I'm very concerned about what's going on there. But, I have talked to people who live in Portland. This stuff is really focused on a few blocks in a very large city, and apparently if you live 5 blocks away, you may not even know that anything bad is going on. So I mean, I think we really don't need to kind of over-dramatize. I would also say, I certainly have issues with a lot of the ideological postulates of Black Lives Matter, but I also think that most people who claim to be supporting that movement really do not support any of that ideology. I think they just think in terms of, we need to stop police brutality against Black people. And I do think that we need to, reframe that whole discussion. But anyway, so I'm just putting in a small kind of plea against over dramatization. I do think that we need to kind of tamp down the polarization that has been happening in this country and get back to dialogue with each other. I think that's, that is a very important part. I think we need to kind of stop screaming at each other and start talking. I would also, if I have a minute, I want to add a really short, kind of comment here that maybe sort of takes us back a little bit to the 1619 project, which again is the kind of kicking off point for this discussion. I think it's very important for people to know American history. It's also, I think, important for people to learn something about the history of world civilizations to understand that some of those things that we're now being asked to see as sort of uniquely American evils are really not. I mean, the slavery, for instance, is the norm, in most of human history. And a lot of these things that, we're talking about, even if you look in terms of slavery in the, relatively modern era, American slavery, as terrible as it was actually not as inhumane in its practices as the slavery in some of the British colonies, the islands, the really horrible slavery that was happening in some of the kind of the sugarcane dominated economies, where a lot of the time, the slaves were basically worked to death. I mean, they were, they generally had a very short life expectancy, and that's not, to downplay the, badness of American slavery. It's to say, if you want to say that it was somehow, uniquely horrible, it really, if you put things in perspective, I think it is important to know the history of the world and the history of other cultures. So that would also be kind of part of my plea. So, I think that we need to restore a solid foundation for education. We need to bring back some solid standards for learning history. And, again, not to say that we need to be going back to the past. I think we need to, move forward on that, but also, on a solid foundation of, both civic and historical education. And, lastly, I want to say, one of the interesting things about a common American identity, one of our kind of foundational values, of course, is individual autonomy. So it's kind of ironic that our ideal is this sort of commonality of individualists. And I think that's, something to remember as we go forward. And I think it's in, reclaiming our individuality and our ability to, think for ourselves and to have, to affirm our individual autonomy, that we kind of also move forward to a kind of American commonness. And that would be my kind of closing observation there.
Will, your thoughts?
Yeah, a lot of good stuff in the past two comments. I mean, my short version, is America in trouble? My answer would be, we'll probably get through it, but yeah. I mean, we're facing, once again, the country is hundreds of years old. We've survived throughout that span of time. But we are facing, again, some pretty serious, potentially existential challenges. I mean, mass immigration in the absence of assimilation has destroyed great nations before. Balkanization, if you look at Yugoslavia, has destroyed, to some extent, the USSR has destroyed great nations before. Communism, in particular, the extreme of socialism, has failed everywhere it's ever been tried. So, those are some of the things that are challenges coming up down the road. I think we'll beat them. America's got a pretty good record of success. I have a great amount of confidence in the country. I'm a proud American. I will say, and there is a backlash to a lot of the nonsense that we are seeing today, I will say. Carol and I are both involved with the 1776 project or initiative, which is, to a great extent, a nonpartisan response from sort of the Black and allied business and social science and so on communities to 1619. We've recently designed an educational curriculum, which, in a blatant plug, you can find at 1776unites.com. But I do think that the silent majority of normal people is going to backlash to and defeat a lot of the things we've been arguing about today. And there have been a couple of pleas for peace made here. I'll close with something of the same, but also a note. I recently helped a feminist friend, a researcher, with some of the stats for a piece about runaway girls. She'll be coming out fairly soon. She wants to know when it does. But essentially, what a lot of these kids said was that they were shocked and horrified that their lives got worse when they left home. They'd been used to one set of events and they believed nothing could be worse. And when they ran away to the big city, which in a surprising number of cases was Portland or Seattle, by the way, they were amazed to find that their dad was verbally abusive, but so was the drug dealer or sex trafficker or whatnot that they ended up working for. Many, many things are worse than the happy middle-class norm that individuals are used to in the USA and hate. So many, many things. I think that virtually anyone who came to this country, even from a solid, stable state like Mexico or Poland, could tell you what some of them are. So when we look at the alternative that's being provided by some of these activists out there in the street, I would encourage people just to Google the images of Chaz Chop after it was recaptured by the police, the small quasi-republic that was set up in Seattle. It was just urine-strewn streets and tents in front of businesses. No one there apparently had a background in construction. They hadn't managed to construct any temporary housing. There were no statues that were still standing, but there were a bunch of the plinths they'd been built on with maybe a foot left. Everything was covered in graffiti. All of the windows were broken. That, to some extent, is the alternative if we allow radicals with an average age of 26 to try to dramatically change society based on sort of this Marxist model. So if you have issues with the United States, to anyone listening, and I know it's a fairly good-sized audience at the bottom of the screen, there are 100 ways to deal with that, from voting to running for office, to the entire list that's been reiterated over and over again. I would encourage people to pursue those rather than pursuing things that have always failed historically every single time they've been tried. And I think that most people will. I tend to be an optimist. We've been very successful in this country. But in the words of one of the founding fathers, once again, we have to hang together or we'll certainly all hang separately.
Thanks. And as we prepare now to just close out this session, and it's been a wonderful session and a lively discussion. Thank all three of our panelists. One final thought, about 1 minute each on teaching civics in K through 12 and teaching civics in a true form in higher ed. Is it needed now, Carol, more than ever?
It is definitely needed. And in Tennessee, we have an organization called the 912 Society, and they give copies of the Constitution to 8th graders in every school across the state. And I believe it's expanded to 3 states. We need that basic knowledge. Students need to know the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution. They need to focus on the Bill of Rights and our historical foundations, which I would argue are Judeo-Christian.
Cathy?
Yes, absolutely. I think that we definitely need more civic education. We need, and I think, my focus would be somewhat different than Carol's in that I would argue we need a more kind of enlightenment-based, civic education. We need to, people need to be familiar with the works of, with at least some of the framework of John Locke, for instance, and some of those other, the thinkers who really gave the foundation for the Declaration of Independence and for the Constitution and really for the Revolution. I think we need, as part of civics, we need to learn to have a more thorough understanding of American history in our schools. And I think, that may include, I think that should include, for instance, the contributions of the Black community to our history from the beginning, and the struggle over abolitionism and the struggle really to extend full citizenship to different groups. And I think, again, there may be some elements of the 1619 Project in terms of Black history that I think could be incorporated into that. But I think, the idea of, there are certainly parts of that project that I think are very, provide a very false understanding of American history, and I think could do, actual harm in terms of, this idea that like everything that makes America unique, as was said here, comes from slavery. And I think that's a really, really deeply wrong-headed idea. So yeah, and to recap, I think we definitely need more solid civics that, looks at the bad, but also focuses on the things that, enable us to move forward.
Will, your final thoughts?
Yeah, we need more civics education. In fact, I think that in our schools, we need more solid education in most practical skills. I mentioned economics and some training in business. I think understanding basic stats. If you look at, for example, the tiny rate of interracial crime in the USA, what these police numbers, these white on black numbers, these black on white numbers really mean would greatly calm tensions in the country. A lot of Americans don't really understand numbers very well. The average American thinks 9% of the population died from COVID, for example. So I think that there's a tendency for people to seek out these sort of messianic solutions, like what we need is utopian communism. I'm almost exactly the opposite. If you ask me to define my sort of brand of kind of center-right business conservatism, I like stuff that works. Yeah, of course we should teach kids civics. Of course that should include Black history, and then we should send them to economics class. That's what the school should be doing, as opposed to a bunch of fluffy nonsense teaching people to become revolutionary poets. There ain't many jobs in that field.
All right. Thank you, and thank all of the panel. This has been wonderful. I've had a great, it's been a great opportunity for me to moderate this panel. I've had a lot of fun with it. I'm Dr. Richard Johnson with the Texas Public Policy Foundation. I direct the Booker T. Washington Initiative with the foundation. And we do have our next lecture coming up at 2 o'clock at 2 p.m. It's Slavery and Liberation, Define the Power of Legree's Ghost. And that's William B. Allen, professor of political science at Michigan State University and Emeritus Dean, James Madison College. Thank all of you for being with us. We've had a wonderful time, and I'll turn it back over to Chance.
All right, everybody. Thank you. We're going to close off now. I hope you guys are all able to join the next session at 2 p.m. Eastern time. Bye, everybody.
Okay.
Guys, I really appreciate you.
Bye. Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you. Thank you.